Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Pension and Trust Committee meeting for the City of Franklin. The first item on the agenda, or actually the second, I'll do a roll call vote, and then we'll go to the approval of minutes for April 11th, 2022. Mr. McDaniel, how do you vote?
Here.
Mr. McGee, how do you vote?
Here.
And Mr. Townsend, how do you vote?
Here.
Mayor Moore, how do you vote?
Here.
And Mr. Bull, how do you vote?
Here.
Ms. Carter, how do you vote?
Here.
The chairman votes present also. So the next item on the agenda is approval of minutes of April 11th, 2022. Hope everyone's had a chance to look at those. Any corrections, deletions, or additions to those?
I'll make a motion.
That's proper motion or a second?
I'll second it.
Let's do a roll call vote on that then. Mrs. Carter, how do you vote?
Agree.
Mr. Bull, how do you vote?
Approve.
Mayor Moore, how do you vote?
Yes.
Mr. Townsend, how do you vote?
Yes.
Mr. McGee, how do you vote?
Yes.
And Mr. McDaniel, how do you vote?
Approve.
And the chair votes yes to the approval of minutes. Let's go to item 3, investment report for 6/30/2022. Christina, you want to lead into that?
Well, we're happy to have Barry Bryant from DayHab is with us virtually from the state of New York, unless he's changed his location, last I heard. So we're glad to have Barry with us to give us an overview. Your packet did have a copy of the report for the second quarter of this calendar year through June 30th. And I'll turn this over to Barry. Barry, would you like to share your comments with us? I do have your presentation pulled up, but our committee does have a copy in front of them, so we can reference if there's any pages that you'd like to refer to.
Am I up first? I gather that means yes. Can you hear me? Let's get my report up. Turn to page 4 of that report. I have 3 subjects and 10 minutes to cover them in. If I go over, we'll do the 3rd subject at the next meeting. So beginning with our returns, this was a truly awful quarter. Domestic stocks, if you look at the Russell 3000, the broadest measure of domestic stocks, that was down 17%. Foreign stocks were down 14%. Even bonds were down, although not nearly as much, about 5%. The only things that were up were energy-related equities and real estate related investments. Real estate was up about 5%. That was the one bright spot. Out of all that, the average public plan had a negative 10.1% return. We, however, had a negative 8.3% return. So we did better than the median by almost 2 full percentage points, which put us in the 25th percentile, meaning we did better than about 75% of the public plans out there. The main reason we did so well was because we had a very large percentage, about 13% in real estate, and our real estate had twice the return of the average. The average was a little under 5. Ours was 8 and change. There were some other reasons, but they were smaller. But that was the main reason that we did as well as we did. And this continues a string of above average returns in both up and down markets, which is really what you're looking for. So nothing but good there. That is all I'm going to say about the return for the quarter. Our longer term returns, as is the case when you consistently do above average, our long-term returns are drifting higher and higher because most people that do well in a good market do badly in a bad market and vice versa. We're doing above average in all markets. So our longer term returns are drifting up. So that's everything I have to say about that. Are there any questions about our returns before I move to subject 2? Hearing none.
Hey, Barry.
Christine asked me to talk a little bit about the very changing returns in the markets. And so I'm going to spend a little bit of time trying to explain that. I'm using this as an opportunity for a lot of to sketch out in real time what the Fed is doing and what the discussion is about in economic circles at the national level about what's going on. And so, in brief, first of all, to set the landscape, we had no inflation for 40 years, going back to about 1980 when Paul Volcker famously broke the back of inflation by raising interest rates. So, starting at that time, the 5 things happen. If you understand this, it goes a long way to making sense about what the markets are doing right now. Number 1, COVID came along and caused 5 things. Number 1, a shift of consumption from services to goods, completely unanticipated. Number 2, production facilities shut down worldwide, but particularly in China, so a reduction in supply of those goods. Number 3, supply chain breakdowns for a variety of reasons, so problems in delivering those goods. And then number 4, Ukraine was invaded by the Soviet Union. That caused energy prices to rise precipitously, and energy is the main input for food prices, and so food prices also went up very rapidly. And then number 5, our government, bipartisan at the time, put a lot of money into people's hands to alleviate suffering from people that weren't able to work. So stimulus checks went out. The last one went out very early in the Biden administration, first quarter 2021. So those were the 5 things that happened. And the macroeconomic consensus among the macroeconomic community was that these were, the word that was used was transitory. By the time the fourth quarter of 2021 came around, it was clear that it was not going to be transitory. And there's been some assertions about what caused it. I don't think we really know yet, although obviously it's going to be studied a great deal. But my feeling is that all of these factors, people were sort of sitting at home. They got kind of complacent. People wanted higher wages. There were more jobs than there were people to fill those jobs. And so wage demands went up, and wage demands are usually at the root of a macroeconomic problem. My 2 cents for what it's worth. So in 2020, fourth quarter of 2021, the Fed finally really realizes we have a problem. And so the 4th thing that happened is the Fed started to fight inflation. And one of my key assertions is that if you strip a central banker naked, what is underneath all their falderall is an inflation fighter. That has not been true throughout American history. The Fed has been asleep at the switch, and willingly so in the past, but not anymore. Once they became convinced that inflation really was a problem, they dedicated themselves to fighting it, and I think they will remain so to the point where they are almost certainly going to overshoot and depress the economy probably more than necessary. But because you never know when you're at that point, when enough is enough, they're not going to know when to stop until it's too late. It is fairly easy to push inflation down to 3.5%. It isn't too difficult to push it down to 2.5%, but it's pretty hard to get it back to 2%, and that's where they want it. So I think we are going to have a recession sometimes at the end of this year or next year, and I think the Fed is going to keep at it until they wring the inflation out of this economy. The chairman of the Fed, Jerome Powell, has been fairly aggressive in his comments. Part of that is to scare people because inflation is in part a psychological phenomenon. And if they can throw a few people out of work, and they may be able to break the back of wage inflation without causing, any more pain than is necessary. That is certainly their goal. And so then we get to the 5th thing. The fifth thing requires a little understanding of the present future value of money. But if you take $100,000, sometimes people will say, okay, $100,000 20 years from now, what is it worth in present value terms with inflation? Well, if you have 2% inflation, $100,000 20 years from now, discounted back to the present value, is worth about $67,000. If inflation goes from 2% to 3%, and you discount that same $100,000 back to the present value, it's worth $55,000. A 1% change in the discount rate changes that amount of money from $67,000 to $55,000, which is to say, the value of future cash flows are very sensitive to the discount rate. So then putting all those factors together, what you're seeing right now is that the market is fibrillating with different changes in their estimate of what that discount rate should be. Nobody knows what inflation is going to be. Nobody knows how fast it's going to come down. But the Fed is dedicated to bringing it down. And so as people's estimates of the inflation problem change, that changes their estimate of the discount rate. And it is that changing estimate of the discount rate that changes the value of stocks, because stocks are, in theory, the discounted present value of future cash flows. So you are seeing right now, on a week-to-week basis, huge swings in the stock market, both up and down, that are based on inflation prints, and there will be another major one this week, and what market participants think the Fed is going to do about it. That's what's going on right now. And it will continue until the pace of future inflation becomes relatively clear. You never know what it is for sure, but the potential bands right now, particularly at any point in time, are now quite wide. When those tighten, the markets will calm down. But right now we have more volatility in markets than usual, and that is likely to continue. Good news is, at least as of right now, the third quarter is still up. Remains to be finished, but July was a very strong month. So that is everything that I have to say about understanding what's going on with the markets. Now, at this particular point in time, my 10 minutes by my clock are up. The third subject I was going to cover is to run through our illiquid holdings, of which there are 5, but there are no decisions to be made about that right now, and I certainly can do it at the next meeting. You all have a number of important agenda items to be decided on later in this meeting, so unless there are any questions or unless you want me to go through those illiquids, I will yield the floor now and do that later. I turn it back over to the chairman, whoever that would be. Yes, ma'am.
Customized index. And so all that's referenced in the book, which is good. Is that customized index static, or does that change? And Christine, you may know this too. Does that index change over time, or is that static, and what we see now is what we saw last year, what we're gonna see over the next 2 or 3 years?
Christine is, I can make an educated guess as to the answer to that question, but I don't know for a fact. I've never asked them that. Do you know the answer, Christine? If not, I'll give you my educated guess. Well, I'm sorry, I thought you were talking about the index against which yeah. I think the index against which the returns are measured is fixed. I think they would change it only if they change the asset allocation. Usually, an index can be different things. It can be used to measure different things. What I would encourage you to do, I wouldn't pay too much attention, frankly, to that index because there's just too much stuff in it. There are too many moving parts. It doesn't really tell you anything. I would pay attention specifically to two things. Number one, take a look at our percentile ranking of the overall portfolio. Now, we've got some stuff outside of TCRS. It doesn't make a huge difference. So when you see that you were ranked in the 25th percentile and are beating 75% of the people, and when you see that you are in the upper half, whether the market goes up or down, that is really, really good. That's what you're looking for. If that ceases to be the case, I will tell you. But they have done very, very well in terms of those percentile rankings. You know, we're trying to do as well as we can, given the return environment, and we're competing against other people. And if we're beating other people, you can assume that we're getting as much out of the return environment as is there. I think we rank in the 12th percentile over 5 years. I have to look a specific number up, but something like that. So in that regard, they're doing really well. Now, the other thing you can look at, if you want to disaggregate the portfolio, if you look in their report, and I'm going to refer to our report because I can navigate it a little bit better. I think it's page page. I think it's 18 or where is it? Okay, now I've passed it. I'm going to start at the beginning and I'm going to start talking about it in the interests of time. We have their portfolio broken down in benchmark, and the parts in the benchmarks are relatively meaningful because there are not so many moving parts in those. And for instance, we bench their large cap. Oh, here it is. Okay, it's in page 18 of our report. If you can get page 18 of our report up, we benched their North American equity against the Russell 3000. That's not a perfect comparison because North American equity's got Canada in it and the Russell 3000 doesn't, and Canada has some very particular, but it's close enough. And so you can see how well they're doing against that benchmark. We have international developed equity benchmarked against EFA, which is a pretty clean comparison. They did not do as well as EFA this time. We have international emerging markets up against that index. They did terribly in relationship to the emerging market index. Now, they have some problems because the legislature has them restricted to some extent where they can invest. So that's a little more complicated, but fair enough. I don't think they did particularly well this quarter. But if you go down and look at real estate, they did 8.2 versus 4.8. And we've got 13% of our money in real estate. And it was the only thing that was up at all. And overall, if you look against our return on negative 8.3 against a shadow index of negative 8.1, which is a weighted average of all our different indices, we did slightly worse than that, but not a whole lot. So that's by way of saying our equity management in this quarter was not particularly good. It was really our asset allocation that carried the day and enabled us to do better. These benchmarks, I think, are meaningful. I think the percentile ranking is meaningful. The TCRS versus their own internal benchmark, that doesn't mean so much to me analytically.
David or anyone, any other questions?
Yes, sir, I'm good.
May I make one
Yep.
comment that I'd like to bring out to the committee for this one? And if you go to page 6 in Barry's document, at the bottom right hand of page 6, there's a table, and this is what I look at. So just for a management viewpoint, certainly we have to take a snapshot in time, and for this closed plan, it is 12/31 is the end of the plan year. That's the snapshot in time. And what we are looking at for management purposes is that 12/31/2021, we were at $160.7 million was the asset valuation. And Barry's reports quarterly, so of course, we're here at the end of the second quarter. But if you compare 160.7 million to 141.2, we've lost a lot of ground. We lost ground in the first quarter, and we lost even more asset valuation here in the second quarter. So certainly, we have another 6 months until that market snapshot is taken for the types of reports that our actuary is getting ready to talk about. But this is what we look at as we go through the year. And I'm sitting here as your city staff, seeing that as a big hole to climb out of. So that's not a technical term, but that's where we are as of June 30th. Now there's one, we do have one account for where we actually pay. You've heard of the cash balance program. There's one aspect of this closed pension that we keep some reserves to make those payments. We've got about $1 million that are not included in that 141, but this gets you a good idea that we've lost considerable ground the first 6 months, and that's we would like to see that go back up, and certainly because we project to have an increase, and that's the investment rate assumption for this plan, which is declining, will be at 6.9% next year. We are projected to have gained 6.9%, but right now we're down 13%. So that's what I'm looking at as we sit here halfway through the plan year. Yes, sir. We
Is it a
did.
number we're trying to get to?
We're going down to 6.5. So we're going down 10 basis points for a few more years to get down to 6. And that's what the Board of Mayor and Aldermen approved, which at that point, if TCRS does not make a change, we will be slightly, they're at 6.75% right now. So we are slightly above TCRS at the moment, but we're going to slowly go down. They choose to, they're historically, at least right now, they've waited and made one big movement, which of course it is expensive to do that. We've been gradual and have stepped down at 10 basis points a year.
So with 10 years going up actuarially, does that maybe slow that? Or are we committed to that's what we're going to do? We're going to 6.5, or can we stop that and go to 6.6? Because rates keep going up, that would help that, right?
That's right. That's right. And certainly as inflation is higher, fixed income returns we would expect to be higher, maybe some impact on equity returns as well. So that's a good point. If certainly if inflation sticks with us, that does put some upward pressure on our assumed rate of return for the same asset allocation. So it certainly might justify taking a fresh look at that somewhere along the way and perhaps slowing that progression.
But just as a point of context, of course, in Tennessee, for a single employer public plan, we cannot be more than 50 basis points higher than what the state rate is. That is a statutory requirement. So if, one of the niceties of us moving down slowly, which we've been doing for a number of years, is that we've been able to stay within that parameter, and when the state has made a big move, we haven't had to make a big move to stay in compliance, because we have been slowly getting closer to what is probably the consensus rate at the time for well-funded pension plans, and
And the state is 6.75 today?
they're currently at 6 points. They moved from 725 to 675 all
And that
at
was
one
in
time.
One move?
Yes,
One move.
one move.
So they are making big steps as opposed to our
Baby
purchase.
steps.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I get it.
But thank you for allowing me to point this out, because that's what we're looking at, is where we're trending
let me
toward
make-
the year.
I'm sorry, Christine, go ahead.
I'm through.
Let me make two quick comments about that. The first is, and I'm using very rough estimates just sitting here in my head, but we probably made about $7 million in the third quarter so far. Now we've lost $19 million from the beginning of the year. I don't have that number. I think that's what Christine said. We lost about $19 million. So, we're not anyways close to all the way back, but that's something. The second is that the national average actuarial assumption is probably about 7, but it's headed down. And so it's going to be at 6.75 soon, if in fact it's not practically there already. That number comes out twice a year.
So what are we now? 7, 7.1? 7?
And we'll be down to 6.9 next time.
At 1/1/2023.
Any other
So
questions any other questions from any committee member? Anyone else? Any other comments? Christine? Then are we ready for the report of the actuary for the plan year ended December the 31st, 2021? I'm ready.
All right, I'll dig in then. I think you've all have this presentation in your packet. I will make one correction to the title page. This says preliminary, but this is actually the final results. We presented preliminary results at the last meeting, and I think nothing material has changed. So I think what I'm going to do is spend most of my time on, and we've touched on a couple of these items already, on slide 6, which is the key valuation results. So a few comments. This shows 4 years of history, including 2022, which is the most important year. But just some general comments. First, you'll notice that our number of active participants is declining by about 7 to 8% per year. Since we're dealing with a closed group, that's largely what we'd expect as active members terminate or retire. They move either into that deferred vested or retired category. And then as retirees or their beneficiaries pass away, they move off the roll entirely. You'll also notice that the annual covered payroll is declining, just as our active population declines. That total payroll covered in the plan is declining, and that's even though the average earnings for those who remain is going up each year. Our present value of benefits is the total value of all benefits expected to be earned by our population. So this includes for our active members some benefit that they're going to earn, we expect them to earn in the future. They have not rendered the service yet that would provide that benefit. So that's an interesting number, but we don't use that for funding purposes. What we use is called the entry age normal accrued liability, which is it's the sum of the next two items, that unfunded supplemental liability and the actuarial value of assets. So the total number is about $177 million. So if you look at that unfunded supplemental liability, we amortize that into the contribution each year. And if you compare that number, the $16.5 million number we have now, with the last few years, it has been dropping rapidly. And that's even though we've been lowering the discount rate, which otherwise raises the liability and should, everything else being the same, grow that gap, grow the unfunded liability. But what's shrinking it, one, is that we're paying a portion of that into the contribution each year, but the big component is we've had investment return far exceeding our assumed return, which the assumed return is essentially the discount rate. So if you look at the actuarial value of assets, we were at $160.8 million at 1/1/2022, and going back just 3 years, we were just under $105 million at 1/1/2019. So asset return has really done well in the last 3 years, which has pushed the contribution down. So if you look at where our total contribution is, it's the $4.1 million number shown fourth line from the bottom. And if you compare that with the last few years, it has been dropping pretty considerably. And that, again, is due entirely to investment return. Since we've been lowering the discount rate, we'd otherwise expect that number to inch up each year. In fact, lowering the discount rate raises the liability by about $2 million and raises the contribution by about $200,000 each year. So we've been more than offsetting that with good investment return. Now, based on the investment report that you've seen year to date, certainly through June 30, this trend is going to reverse most likely, unless we have really good investment return in the rest of the third and the fourth quarter. So we're probably looking at something more like where we were in 2021 or 2020. In fact, I think the asset number, current asset number, maybe as of June 30, was $141 million. That compares just a little higher than the $136.8 million where we were 1/1/2021. So certainly with lowering the discount rate a little, we expect that to hurt us, as it has every year, but the investment return we expect to hurt us more. So certainly compared to where we were at 1/1/2022 with a $4.1 million contribution, we would expect the number to be back above $5 million if everything holds as it is now at 1/1/2023.
And Kevin, if you don't mind, I would like to share as a point of information, additional information, that, of course, the column that is 2022, this is the information that we used for the fiscal 23 budget process, for the fiscal 23 city budget process. And we actually, and we'll talk about it in our next item, but staff asked the Board of Mayor and Aldermen to consider staying at the higher contribution rate for the closed pension, because we asked them to do that to keep our funding as secure as possible. So, and then the Board of Mayor and Aldermen did approve. So we actually, the starting budget for this current fiscal year did contribute $5.1 million to the closed pension, even though the required amount would have been $4.1 million. So, and this board for the last few years, except there was 1 year we weren't able to, but this board in the last 3 years has contributed more than the minimum required contribution to the closed plan, whether it be at the start or added to it as the fiscal year continued, and the revenue picture was a little more clear. So while the minimum contribution was the 4.1, the board contributed 5.1.
Let's see, a couple of other comments. Let's see, that security ratio you see at the bottom, you'll notice that number has been increasing nicely from the 91% at 2019 up to 109% for 2022. That is, if everyone who's active terminated today, the benefit they've earned today compared to the asset value. So you'd have actually more assets than needed to pay benefits based on that assumption. However, we know that everyone's not going to terminate today. Folks are going to continue. Some folks are going to continue to work. Hopefully, a considerable number of them. And I apologize if I'm a little rough at how I say that, but certainly not everyone's going to terminate. That we would be missing our actuarial assumptions badly if that occurs. And so they're going to continue to earn benefits. So you on that measure. Assuming they have future service, you're not in a surplus position. In fact, I flip back one slide to slide 5. If you look at that middle row there, that's the best measure of how well the plan is actually funded. The inter-age normal accrued liability is $177.3 million versus assets of $160.8. So on that measure, you're 90.7% funded. And generally, we consider anything above 80%, maybe 85% to be well funded. We used to say 80%, but as plans have actually become better funded over the last few years, so you probably want to be 85% or better on that measure. And that number has been coming up nicely over the last few years, again, even though you've been lowering the discount rate, which would otherwise hurt the funded ratio, as well as it increases the contribution by lowering the discount rate.
$0.1 million, is that right?
Yes, that is what the board, we went ahead, the city administrator's proposed budget this year, while we had just received, it was right off the ink, if we still use ink, that was a brand new number, but we had gone through the budget process anticipating the $5.1 million. And then when we finally got the number, we still asked, that was the formal ask, was to keep the contribution at 5.1, because truly keeping this fund in well-funded status is certainly what the board's been wanting to do and has a goal to do. So we went ahead and went through with that, requesting that contribution.
If 4.1 was kind of the number we thought, now that's going to be off by $1 million. So we're all going to hit the number that's going to come in, but we won't be overfunded, right? Or it looks like we still will be overfunded?
No, you certainly won't be
Okay.
overfunded. The additional $1 million improves the funded status slightly, but it doesn't make you overfunded. I think the nice thing is that you didn't drop the contribution and then have to raise it back the year following, because the less than stellar market results are going to push the contribution back up to where we were a couple of years ago. One additional comment I'll make just on the discount rate in general and how that has declined. And this kind of, looking back to Barry's comment about 7% being the average among public sector plans. In general, each plan should look at their own investments and really measure the expected rate of return on those assets to determine an appropriate discount rate. Now, having said that, there is considerable benefit in being conservative on that, so being a little less than what you expect to earn, because you'd like surprises, positive surprises as opposed to negative surprises there. They're much easier to deal with. So when we look at averages of all public sector plans, there are quite a few plans out there that closed many, many years ago, have only retirees left, and have largely a fixed income portfolio, and do have fairly low expected returns for those plans. Plans that we would call young plans with relatively few retirees, more active members, those plans may take on a little more risk and have higher expected returns. So certainly comparing to averages is useful, but you largely want to look at how your plan is invested and what actual expected returns are. Now, having said that, being at 7 or 6.9 now versus TCRS is 6.75, arguably the bulk of the trust is invested the same way TCRS is, so you want to be pretty close to them. However, I would say TCRS is probably pretty conservative with the 6.75, given that they're taking only big adjustments or infrequent adjustments to the rate. They're not doing it every year the way the Franklin plan is. And so certainly I think it makes sense that we're going to drop below them at some point, likely before they make their next adjustment to the rate.
So with that statement, you're saying that the state will not make an adjustment for the next 4 or 5 years then?
I can't say that definitively, but that's been their pattern, to only
Okay.
look at it when they do actuarial experience studies, and therefore just adjust the rate on about every 4-year cycle. I think it was for the 1/1, or for the 7/1/2022 valuation. I believe that's correct. Yeah, it may have been
Yes.
7/1/2021.
They announced it last fall, I believe.
Okay, so it was like a 7/1/2021.
We're
The only way we
coming up
get
on a
in
year.
Any kind of trouble is if they go down by 50 beeps, we're out of whack, and then we have to adjust by 20, but everything being normal, we're gonna come in under where they are.
If they continue to act the way they have in past, they seem to take it, they don't act frequently, but when they do, they take it down by a lot. So,
Right. So according to state law, you just have to be no more than 7.25 right now, since they're at 6.75. And that's for any plan in the state, regardless of how you're invested, which, going back to what I just said about you should largely look based on, that could create some challenges for some plans that are invested in a way that they think they may earn more than 7.25, but state law says they've got to come down below that.
Any other questions from the committee for our actuary? Mayor, any questions?
I do have one question, since you've asked me, and I remember a number of years ago, we did some pension bonds to help shore up the
Yes.
percentage of funded for our plan. I was just kind of curious where we stand on that right now.
would you like me to start? And
If you want to start,
we're actually, it's going to be a good segue to our next.
It's kind of a preview
present-
of coming attractions. We're going
Our
to
next
talk about that in the next
presentation.
presentation.
But,
ESP.
I believe it was in 2014.
Yes, we
that
issued them in 14.
The Board of Mayor and Aldermen issued $10 million of pension obligation bonds, and those proceeds were placed into the pension trust, and then the board began the next year repaying those principal and interest over a 10-year period. And so certainly, when we're going to show some history on this next item, kind of spend a few minutes kind of talking about the modern history of the closed plan, and you'll see the impact of the funded ratio of that $10 million contribution, and certainly, and also the contribution that the city has made to repay those bonds.
I would have one other comment. This is a pretty flexible committee, so if there's anybody that has a question from the audience other than the committee members or those of us who are participating, you're more than welcome to raise your hand. I'll recognize you. You can ask your questions. That's really what we're here for, is to make sure that everyone understands what we're doing and why we're doing it. And I'll give you my history lesson. When we moved this from Chattanooga in the mid-90s, it was worth about $3 million. So you've gone from 1992, 3, 4, somewhere along in there, up to the value that it is right now. I think we looked at 141 million. So that's the reason we're here. But if you've got questions, you're more than welcome to ask those questions. We'll take the time to answer them. Any questions from the committee? Are we ready for the next item?
Yeah, okay. All right, I'll do a little bit of an introduction, and then Christine has a more detailed presentation for you, and then I might circle back again at the end. But one of the things you may remember at our April meeting, we talked about the annual cost of living adjustment. And that's something we've done really on a certain approach for the last 13-plus years. And we struggled with the sudden surge in inflation that we experienced. And we looked at a best practice in most pension programs where there's some form of a cap on how much that would grow. We talked to you all about that. We made a recommendation to cap that in this calculation at 4.5%. We brought that to the board, had a good discussion with the board. Ultimately, the board approved the same recommendation that you brought forward. Some of the feedback, though, that we got in the wake of that was we really need a broader policy to guide it so that it's clear and we're not sort of adjusting each year based on a calculation. Let's have something a little more defined. And so staff has worked on that the last few months. Christine's helped lead that, working with HR, myself, and thinking through what that could look like, doing some studies of what some other communities do, other pension systems do. So this is really the fruit of that work, and we want to share with you what is a recommended approach and get your feedback on that and see if you're comfortable making a recommendation to the board. I will qualify, this is a significant change, so if you need more time, that's okay. This doesn't come around until the spring of next year, and so we understand that you may want a little bit of time to think about it. That's okay too, but we do want to walk you through the recommendation, the history that supports it, the benchmarking we've done with other pension systems that bring it to us, and Christine will take you through that, and we're glad to answer any questions at the end and talk a little more about what our recommendation is and how it blends both the status, the performance overall of the pension system with what inflationary impacts are as well. So we think it's a good balance of providing that cost of living, but also making sure we're managing within our means, respecting what state law also has in place too. So Christine, take it away.
Well, thank you, and we appreciate your service on this committee, and also hopefully your willingness, the next 3 items, to provide us your feedback and have a good discussion. I do want to, before we jump into some graphs and charts and all of this, introduce just a few people in case you don't know them, to be able to, once we get to that part of conversation, we do have some experts here. Certainly our pension professionals, we have Frank Carney, our pension counsel, is with us, and we have Kevin Sullivan, our actuary, is with us. You've just heard from Kevin. We appreciate all of their assistance. We also have our city attorney, Shauna Billingsley, is here with us. And she has been a big help to us as we've gone through this analysis. I'd also like to introduce someone that I don't know that a couple of folks, Alderman Barnhill may have met, as well as Mayor Moore, but Tyler Sullivan from our finance department is with us, and I'd like to have Tyler wave. Tyler joined us full-time back in May, and he has helped do a lot of the research for this presentation, and I do want to acknowledge Tyler has learned a lot about researching government records, and so I appreciate his assistance in this project. So, yes, what caused us to put this together was what happened, the way the city administrator described as going to our board. Of course, we started with the pension committee with the cost of living increase for July 2022. It was complicated, had a lot of considerations to it. But as we got through that period and certainly began implementing the cost of living for July 23rd, we sat back and said, we'd like to look at the modern history of this closed pension plan, because we still have active employees in this plan. We have retirees who are depending on this plan. Our board has been funding this plan at a high level for a long time, but we're sure that this plan has probably changed, and there's probably a story that we can tell in the modern era of this plan, and not all of us probably know that. So we're going to just kind of walk through some of these measures over about a 30-year period of the closed pension, even though this plan is now 50 years old. It was 50 years old last year. So we just a few particulars about the closed single employer pension program. There's a lot more details than this, but we're really going to be focusing a little bit more on the financial history of this plan. But it is important to recognize it is a 51-year-old plan at this point. It is considered closed, which means that new hires to the city are not enrolled in this program. So when you hear about a closed plan, it doesn't mean that there's not active members. It doesn't mean that it's not paying benefits. It just means that new hires are not being enrolled in this plan. So the last new hire, full-time hires to the city from the end of 2016, we actually, everyone is vested now. Everyone has served at least 5 years, so we know who is vested in this closed plan, whether they choose to stay with us until their retirement or not, but we know that they're going to be eligible for benefits, and those are all of the people that we know of at this point. There are several different tiers of benefits in this closed plan. That's something that certainly Kevin and Frank see lots of plans and advise on lots of plans, and probably the older plans are, the more the more tiers that can be done over time. Things just change, and elected bodies change and such. So this plan, while it's closed to new participants, it does have several different tiers to maintain of benefits. Just a couple of big high picture of those tiers. Certainly, beginning in 2010, new hires began making an employee contribution to this plan, 5% of their salary before the 2010 mark. It was entirely employer funded. The benefit multiplier is a 2%. That was a change from 1% when the plan was established, and then it increased in the early 2000s. And you'll be able to see that on a graph here in a moment without me even pointing that out probably. It's primarily full retirement at 25 years of service. There are, once again, in the tiers, a little bit of differentiation in that. As Kevin mentioned in his presentation, the number of active employees is declining in this plan. I pulled from the last report, we were a little over 400 active employees, and we have over 800 full-time employees in the city now. So that does show you that. And all of our full-time employees are either in the closed plan, or if they've been hired since January 1st, 2017, are members of our our Tennessee Consolidated Retirement System state plan. There will come a point, long ways down the road, in which we will not have any active employees in the plan, and we will have all retirees receiving benefits, or inactive vested employees who are not yet receiving benefits. I mean, of course, that's hopefully way down, because we got some really good folks we hired in 2016 that we hope stay with us a long time. So eventually those numbers will keep on. The actives will reduce and the retirees will increase. Like I said, there's a lot more details to that, but certainly that gives you a flavor of what this plan includes. Next, as Chairman Barnhill was describing his history with knowing and managing this closed pension plan, is just the change in the asset valuation, and the asset valuation has grown, which it should, along with the total pension liability over almost about a 27-year period. Back in 1994, the asset valuation was $5.6 million. The end of the last plan year, it was $160 million. Pension liability was essentially equal to the asset valuation back in 1994. It was $5.4 million, and that pension liability, as our actuary was describing at the end of last year, was $177 million. So that's if you want to consider that a modern era, I think that's what we would expect to see. Certainly, it's the story of the gap between the two lines really never has got too wide. And if you think about the stories you've read in the papers about pension plans, they're certainly ones that when the required contributions were not made, they widened significantly, and that's where a plan would be funded maybe only at half, or certainly not as high as 70 or 80%. So that's a good story, even though it certainly illustrates that the responsibilities to the city have increased significantly over close to a 30-year period.
Quick question, if I could. Looking at those lines on the graph, if you plotted a similar line for number of employees that we have, would it parallel the red line?
That is certainly one part of the factor, is adding employees, because when you add salaries, it's probably not as much as, when you add salaries, you add future liability to future benefits. But there were also changes to the benefits themselves during this period. And so that was also the benefits that were being promised, as well as the number of employees and their salaries, are also other inputs.
Are there healthcare benefits? Is there a healthcare stipend in there, or is it just strictly salary?
Well, healthcare for active employees, or what's considered pension earnable wages,
Is that pulling from this fund or anything?
it is not. Our retiree healthcare plan is not reported. We do have to report that liability, but it is a separate liability calculation. It's not embedded within closed pension. And the next chart we have, while it's certainly it's a different type of, it's an area. I didn't actually do a line because the lines would be all over the place. But the city's contribution to the closed pension by fiscal year, there is a story to this that certainly, back in 1992, that was a very small amount. It was actually, I think, $403,000 back in 1992 was the exact amount of the city to the closed pension. And then we rock along at less than $1 million a year until we get to the 03 timeframe, which was where the benefits were increased. So we went from the 1% multiplier up to the 2% multiplier. And then, of course, there's where the liabilities increase. So the city needs to contribute more to stay funded. Something that we will notice is that there's been several times in which the city has made additional contributions above what was required to make. And that's what this graph, and I tried to put in the notes, give you a little bit more detail, is that there has been several years that the board has put additional contribution in. What's included in here is the actual additional contribution, and then once the city issued the $10 million of bonds, there was a requirement to pay annual principal and interest. And that orange, while if you look at our city's budget and our audit, the debt service is paid. That debt service is paid from a debt service fund from property taxes. That's a requirement that those are full faith and credit of the city of Franklin. But though the bonds were issued for the pension fund, so that was $1.16 million a year that went from property taxes toward paying back that $10 million that was issued to help shore up the pension fund. So if you consider in 2023 the annual appropriation, which is the $5.1 million that the board is paying, as well as the debt service, the $1.16 million on those pension obligation bonds, this year's current budget, the city is putting $6.3 million toward the closed plan. So that's a strong desire of the board to keep this closed plan in good financial shape. Now, I'm sitting beside our actuary, so hopefully I will do this okay. I'm talking about some detailed math here. Hopefully, it won't sound like an actuary probably, but I'm going to do my best, and Kevin can help me. We want to talk about the funded ratio because, as Kevin was describing, there are several different ratios that are used to describe the funded status of a pension plan, the funded health of a pension plan. And certainly one, the security ratio that he was describing, is if you assume that everyone who is a member of the plan quit today. And my goodness, we hope that doesn't happen. We need them to provide services, and they do a great job at it. So that is a measure, but it's not a realistic measure. And this funded ratio, it's a measure of plan liability that is, it's called the entry age normal accrued liability, which certainly our actuary was reporting. But that is taking a present value of these projected benefits of your plan members Between when they were hired and when they may retire, we have to make a best guess at that. But it's allocated as a level basis over the service year. So while there are assumptions, and certainly someone may choose to work longer than we know that they want to work, it does anticipate that people stay with us. It's not an anticipation that their benefits, that their salaries in today. So this is not maybe the highest way to make a ratio. However, it's more realistic because people who have been in service here for a number of years, we hope that they're going to stay here and continue their career. So this is an industry standard. This is also the calculation method that the state of Tennessee uses to evaluate our plan according to state statutory practices. So there are two thresholds for funded ratios and certainly the first one I wanted to describe is this 80%. That is the threshold for considered a well-funded plan. And as Kevin was describing, we certainly everyone would like to be 100% funded or even greater than 100% funded. That's a really high bar. And but as you look historically at pension plans, there's a lot of literature that talks about 80% as being well-funded. And so there's we look at literature from bond rating agencies. The city of Franklin has 2 bond ratings, and both of those, Moody's and Standard & Poor's, evaluates our pension plan. We look at there's lots of even recent professional papers that talk about 80% as being well funded. So certainly we appreciate that our current mark from 12/31/2021 was 90%, but it is an ever-moving target, and we agree with our actuary that the 80% well-funded threshold means something. That's meaningful to our to people who evaluate us, and hopefully it's meaningful to our employees and our retirees that our plan is well-funded. If we can have a goal of, if everyone has the same basis that the 80% is well-funded. There is also a 60% threshold in Tennessee state law. And this came in 2014. There's a Tennessee statutory authority and there's several aspects of that statute that came in 2014, but any pension plan that is funded less than 60% it cannot actually add benefits unless approved in advance by the state of Tennessee's treasurer. And that's Mr. David Lillard's our current our treasurer here in Tennessee. Every year, our closed pension plan is evaluated by the state. We provide documents, and we receive an evaluation letter, and this 90% threshold calculation for this year is what was returned to us by the state of Tennessee. So we do think the 60% is important because it's in state law that really the state treasurer doesn't really want you to add to benefits if you are not at the 60% level. There are quite a few inputs to this calculation, but we just wanted to point out a few things that certainly are under the control in this calculation of the Board of Mayor and Aldermen. And even things that are even the aspects that are under their control have some caveats to it. Certainly the annual city contribution to the closed pension is something that it's a budget authorization. The Board of Mayor and Aldermen does vote on that. However, the state of Tennessee does require that a local government must appropriate at minimum the required amount per the actuarial study that, in our case, USI provides. So many states, that is not a requirement, but in Tennessee, this closed plan must be funded at minimum what the actuary requires us. So the board has been doing its duty, and it's been doing more than it's obligated, but it is a requirement in Tennessee. Certainly the benefit structure, the Board of Mayor and Aldermen establishes those benefits. However, once these benefits are established, the board can't turn around and reduce those for employees that fall underneath those periods of time. Now, the board can change benefits for future hires, and that's how we ended up with so many tiers and the complications. But the board can't go backwards, and there's case law that supports that is something that once benefits are established, they cannot be reduced. The salaries of active employees down the road will lead to retirement benefits, and so certainly the board every year considers funding of salaries whether there'll be a cost of living increase or merit increases. It certainly is at their discretion. However, certainly if the board doesn't keep active employee salaries competitive to the market, we're going to have a hard time keeping and finding employees. So, yes, it is something that they control, but they need to keep services going, at the present time. So they have to be careful that they keep our salaries as close to market as they possibly can so that we can keep employees here with us. And then finally, the investment rate earnings assumption, we've talked about how that is set by the board. However, there are state requirements that it must be within 50 basis points. It can't be 50 points. It has to be within 50 basis points of the state of Tennessee Board of Trustees rate. So there are aspects the board puts in place, but they don't have full control over all these inputs. The major input that they do not have control, of course, is the performance of the investment portfolio. And we've just talked quite a bit about it. I did want to give you an example, actually using some numbers that, while if we had a $150 million portfolio balance and we had a decrease, in this case, in this example, we have a 5% actual decrease in valuation. Yes, there's a decrease in dollar amount from where we started to where we ended, but because we had assumed that we were going to increase in value, the total amount of that actuarial loss is actually the combination of the two. So we can dig a hole out of the control of what our board could ever intend because of market performance, and of course as our portfolio grows, that sensitivity is significant. So here's another graph looking at the modern history of our plan, and we thought this would be interesting to you to see the funded ratio of this plan since 1995. I think it's an interesting story, and please keep in mind those two thresholds, the 60% and the 80%, because we were actually funded greater than 100% at the start of this period. As the benefits changed, we then went beneath what that 60% threshold is. Of course, keeping in mind that was before 2014, so the state law that now is applicable wasn't in place at that point. But certainly the story since that low funded ratio of 2003 has been working out of that. Part of it was the pension bonds. Part of it was certainly the increased funding that the board put into the plan. I would also, my personal opinion is also, of course, moving the investment management to the state of Tennessee several years ago. That has saved significant money in fees to this plan, and that money stays into here to help support the closed plan. So we've only been below the 60% one time. We have been below the 80% 7 times, and but we've bounced around the 80% range, probably for the last decade. It
Hey,
appears.
Christine, explain again. So the pension bonds, that, in I guess layman terms, instead of us, the city, coming out, injecting $10 million of cash, we borrowed the bonds, and we're just injecting that in over 10 years. Is that?
Well, what we did was, pension obligation bonds are taxable for IRS purposes. They're not tax exempt, but they are full faith and credit of the city. The bonds were issued, and the $10 million less the issuance fees, it was 9.9 something million, that was deposited into the pension fund.
And so it's
It's been
going
there.
into the stocks and bonds and everything else.
Yes.
And the decision was that we just, instead of just raising taxes or whatever and injecting 10 million cash, we just borrowed it. Is that right?
And that we could gain legally a higher rate of return
Right.
than what we were going to pay in interest in the bonds. So it was a legal arbitrage, if
Exactly.
you will,
Exactly.
and a way to do that kind of effectively over
limited
10
to
years,
how much
spread it
of-
out over 10 years.
Are we limited how much of that we can do? Is there a,
I think it was just a calculation of what we thought would be responsible, what we could handle, and 10 million over 10 years seemed like a kind of a measured approach
yeah,
to it.
Yeah, okay.
So it was just a kind of a judgment call, quite frankly.
So that is at our disposal again if we needed it.
Well,
Correct.
the state of Tennessee has changed the issuance of pension bonds
sure
since
they have.
that time. And it's
We
also.
got in under the wire.
Well, and it's also the practice, these bonds were issued at a time in which taxable rates were very low. If you look back, with that mirror, if there are places that have issued taxable bonds when the rates were high, and certainly if the average return is 7% and you're paying 7 or 8 or 9% interest on that debt, you're not winning the arbitrage. And so the point in time in which this $10 million issuance, because I believe these rates are more in the 3 to 4% range, taxable rates were at a historic low. But that's not the case in many of the places that have issued pension obligation bonds. So what Tennessee did a few years ago was say that they pretty much shut off the ability in Tennessee to do pension obligation bonds unless, I believe you have to close the plan, which we've closed it, but then they just want to make very sure that you don't get caught into issuing pension obligation bonds and then you don't earn back as much as you're paying in interest, because it is an arbitrage. Are there any questions about? I think this is a really telling graph of the history, and it's a great story in modern times. But it shows you the sensitivity of making significant changes to your plan. Well, now yes, sir.
Cover just a little bit the benefit multiplier from 1% to 2%, because that is in 2003, isn't it?
Yes, when the multiplier was changed on the benefit structure from 1% to 2%, that there was actually and I believe there were also changes in the number of years and retirement when you could retire. This may sound certainly familiar to you. There were additional changes, but that was the significant change that had the plan go from being extremely well funded. I mean, I'm over 100% funded down to less than the 56%.
It kind of cut it in half. I mean, you can see the math is pretty straightforward. There are other moving pieces, but that's essentially what drove it.
Well, thank you for bearing with me through some history there, but we'll circle back to where this committee left. We left you back several months ago with the cost of living increase provisions, and our current plan document really doesn't give, it gets very broadly written, and I believe that's how Frank describes it. The Board of Mayor and Aldermen may provide a cost of living increase for retirees and beneficiaries by resolution. It doesn't tell the Board of Mayor and Aldermen how to calculate that. It doesn't say when they're going to implement it. It doesn't even require them to act at all. However, we've had a practice for the last 13 so years in which, and when you see some comparables here, our practice is very common to other well-funded plans in looking at doing a comparison of these CPI indexes and doing an annual change. That part is very similar to other well-funded plans. It's not that certainly is not written into the plan document at the current time. And like Eric said, that's how we had kind of rocked along for a good number of years, and that in a fairly constant economic environment, we were using a best practice, but it was not written into the plan. And then we came to the spring of 2022, and the Board of Mayor and Aldermen did provide a COLA increase of 4.5% after significant discussion at the time of consideration. We do want to show you the history of the cost of living adjustments in the modern era for this plan, and so we bookend that with the 4.5% for this current fiscal year, And then certainly the other high is at the start. In fact, we researched as back as far as we could find it, and I give Tyler a lot of credit. We go back to 92, and that was also a high point at the 6%. And looking back at the economy and where the Consumer Price Index was actually back in 92, that was a year in which that CPI change was over about 5% or a little over. So certainly there was inflation. While maybe it's not as memorable as like the early 80s inflation, there was something going on there in 92. But just a couple of things to point out that if you don't take into consideration, if you consider 23 and 92 as outliers, the average has been 2.12% over this period. I know there's been I've been with the city now almost 6 years. There was 1 year in which the city, the board went ahead and had a cost of living for the retirees in which there wasn't funds for the active employees. And I believe there was another year during Eric's time with the city in which that matches with the history that every year in this modern time there has been a cost of living that the board has awarded by resolution. And so that has been the practice. And I believe in our actuarial assumptions, it's just a little over 2% is what is being factored into the calculations, because that has been it's kind of been our average. It's been the 2%, a little over 2% during this era. Did you have anything else on?
No, this matches the practice. We've done this calculation at least since 2009 in my time here, that tied directly to a CPI calculation at the end of March that we calculated in April, brought it to this committee. They made a recommendation, went to the board followed through, and then we implemented it July 1, has been the practice in my time here. And then we had the different adjustment or different approach last year just because of the significant surge in inflation, and recognizing that sort of created an open-ended obligation potentially for the pension system, and that could be really disruptive in our ability to manage it and keep it stable long-term. And that's why we essentially went with a lower number, capped it there, but then the desire was to have a more complete policy discussion.
Before you go to that,
Yes, sir.
you have a graph that shows the cost of living increase over
I-
time or similar time?
We did the calculation. I did make the graph. It's very close to this. It's very close. You can tell that there was 1 year that it looked like the CPI was actually less than 1, but I believe it was rounded up to 1. That was where when you see our recommendation in a moment, that I believe this is from looking at this, I do think that there has been analysis done over this period that March CPI has been analyzed, and certainly it was taken into account even in that 92 number percentage that looks high. It was a high year on the change in CPI. I won't read all these to you, but we did look at a couple different areas of comparison for you of policies of both highly funded state public pension plans, as well as some comparable cities to Franklin, to look at what their plans have in place. And certainly we had to look for the last published rates, but maybe 2 years old now, but something that I think should make us feel good is that our practice on using changes in CPI, with the exception of one state, which I'll leave Wisconsin out here for the moment, these other well-funded states all seem to use changes in CPI as a basis. Some use different months for year-over-year change, which that's fine. The state of Tennessee actually uses April. We have been using March, but that's okay. So that seems to be pretty consistent. Everyone has a cap except for Wisconsin, but I'll I'll save that just for a second because I think theirs, while it doesn't have a cap, it's not really something that we would probably want to pattern ourselves after. But the caps have ranged on these from, there's actually 1% on a couple of them to 3.5%. But the TCRS, which is certainly important for us to look at or give consideration to, is that 3%. And so Wisconsin, while they don't have a maximum rate, they actually have some history in which they reduce benefits because they tie it very directly to the investment portfolio, and that seems kind of harsh to me. So it's for people on fixed incomes. For people on fixed incomes, that seems a hard way to do that. But they are a well-funded plan, so I guess they're doing something right. But I don't know that that's necessarily the comparable for us. So those are some state plans to take a look at. Interesting enough, some of these cities that we consider we have some features in common with. They are all part of state systems where they are located. We look at Wilmington, Asheville, Cary, North Carolina. They're all part of the state of North Carolina system. We have Mount Pleasant, South Carolina is also part of the state system, Dublin, Ohio, and Naperville, Illinois. Once again, with the exception of an outlier of South Carolina's system, the CPI calculation is pretty universal, except North Carolina's adds, while they have a higher maximum rate, they tie that to that you have to have, at least investment gains have to equal the, what that max rate, what that change would be, so that could be difficult, I would think, to have. But this gives you an indication of the, it appears that the maximum rate of 3% is common, even though some of these have slightly lower or slightly different ways in which the benefit is calculated.
And the 3% for our specific plan, that would be for all three tiers, regardless, right? We're not saying, oh, this tier gets 2.5 because this would just be.
Our proposal is not to treat the tiers differently. We've never in the past treated the tiers any differently by resolution of the board. I don't think that we would look to do that. It's pretty complicated keeping up with everybody in the tiers, so. So as your staff, we wanted to propose for discussion purposes a cost of living proposal, a policy, given that our current plan language is very broad. We know that our board mayor and alderman wants to continue maintaining a well-funded status. That's for the benefit of the city as also our retirees. A more directive cost of living policy is transparent to retirees and current active employees. In comparison, our current plan, when you take our current plan and compare it to the TCRS plan, that it's very different in what an employee would think their expectations are. We surveyed well-funded state plans, peer cities, to get an idea of what's out there, and then also keeping in mind that we do have the Tennessee Consolidated Retirement Plan does have a cost of living policy that's been in place for many years. So I know I've done a lot of talking, and so this is where we would like to open up for conversation. That as we looked at all of these factors, we'd like to get your feedback on a cost of living policy, which would actually be delineated by threshold category. 80% being the funded ratio of 80% and higher. Kind of the middle, where you're between 60% and 79%, which is you're not inadequately funded, but it's not either well-funded or inadequately funded, and then the 59% and lower threshold, which correlates to a state of Tennessee statute, and so we looked at certainly we wanted to present this out for conversation. A a threshold of 3.5, and certainly we want to stay with the CPI calculation, that has, seems to have worked well, and really every year except for probably 2 years, in this last 30 years, it would not have hit a maximum rate. And we probably would have hit a minimum floor at once. And at that time, the practice, apparently, we did go ahead and do a 1% cost of living. So as you can see, we're looking at maybe a 3.5% cost of living maximum rate if we're considered well-funded, 2.5 in the middle category, and we believe the state law threshold would indicate that we shouldn't add to benefits if we're below the 60%. And then also, we would like your feedback if you would like to consider a minimum cost of living of at least 1%, as long as we're not below the state threshold of 60%. So Eric, would you like to?
No, I think Christine gave you a lot of great background on it. And we didn't get to this lightly or easily. We really tried to look at it. And I think the idea of linking the funding ratio and how we're doing to how we handle the cost of living increase makes a lot of sense. We follow it, but when it exceeds a certain level, we've got to have a cap just so that we can manage it. Otherwise, you really don't know what your target is long term. And so I think that's really important. It is, as you saw from the comparatives, pretty much a best practice to at least have some range that you manage it within, or something that either from the funding standpoint or from just a general cap is in place. And what we're proposing is a blend of both of those together. I think the minimum gives you at least a floor. We had not originally talked about that, but as we looked at it, thought that was a good component to add, that at least we're making some adjustment as long as we're 60% or better each year. And it's trying to strike the right balance of managing the fund, being responsible, but also recognizing that inflation impacts our retirees, and that these adjustments and these regular adjustments are an appropriate thing to do to take care of our retirees as well. So trying to strike that right balance, and we look forward to your feedback and any questions you have to help us understand that. Again, we would look for this committee to make a recommendation to the board, and then the board would consider it, and they would ultimately be responsible for implementing this. But obviously, they're going to want your feedback too in terms of how you see it and any other perspectives on it. So turn it over to the committee.
Committee, does anyone have any questions?
Yeah, I've got a couple of questions. Since this came out on Friday, my mind's been going crazy with it. But I don't know where to start. And this may be more of an actuary question. When you're figuring how long a participant's going to be receiving benefits, what's that number?
It depends on their current age. And
Okay.
It depends on their gender. Generally, if you're looking at someone who's 65 years old, we're expecting a life expectancy, past 85 for
Okay.
those individuals.
So 20 to 30 years
Yeah, 20, 25 probably,
is reasonable. Okay. Next question, the 1 to 3.5%, let me start by saying this, I guess. I fully understand the need for the policy. I think it's needed. I think a cap is necessary to kind of help with our liability and surprises and all of that. Definitely a minimum is necessary to make sure that we're taking care of the retirees. The 1 and 3.5 numbers, did that come because that's what everybody else is doing? Did that come because that's what the last 30 years have looked like? Or where did those specific numbers come from?
I really think it's kind of a judgment call, looking at the benchmarks and looking at what we've actually experienced overall. So I'd say it's kind of both. What is sort of a best practice? What are most people using? TCRS, who's our partner in all this, uses 3. And we knew that when we did 4.5 last year. So we're still going a little bit above them when we're at that 80% funded level or better. So it's a judgment call, honestly, and it was a mix of both of those, I would say. that we felt made sense and fit within what is generally happening with well-managed pension programs.
And also tying it to our funded ratio, I think is a good idea. I think that's important. I guess kind of my biggest hangup on it is between 92 and 2022, the CPI increases, like you said, have been between that 1% and the 3.5% largely. If you go back beyond that to the 70s and 80s, or the 3.5, if this plan had been in place there, then our retirees would have taken a big hit when it comes to there's COLAs versus what CPI is. And so I feel like that while the policy is a good idea, I'm not sure that the 1 and 3.5 are the right numbers to protect our retirees in a period of extended inflation.
Any other comments on the presentation that Christine's done so far?
To the point, I mean, if there's continued inflation, this isn't a plan that, I mean, there's the only thing I've heard that you couldn't change, like when we went from the 1 to the 2 multiplier, that's in stone, right? So anything we do now, is that saying that that's in stone, it can't be changed? So if we get 3 or 4 more years, you look back and now we're in the 70s and you're getting 7%, we can't change that, or we can change that?
The way this is done is as an amendment to the plan. So it can be changed by resolution, but it is putting a specific form, and we talked a little bit about this as staff. We're putting it in there so that it's clearly defined. The way it's written right now is it says the board can make an adjustment, and that's pretty much all it says. It doesn't dictate timing. It doesn't dictate the formula. We have a practice that we've used for at least the last 13 years, but this was an attempt to be more clear and to put it in. We chose to propose it as an amendment to the plan, but you could do it as just a general board policy.
I mean, does it put us in a box negatively that we shouldn't put ourselves in?
Maybe I can help on
Yeah,
the,
please.
on the wording.
Yeah,
Maybe
yeah.
I can help on the wording. So this wording, of course, is subject to change. So this is, but we tried to word it as best we could, and the actuaries have to chime in too. Because when you look at this schedule here, the first thing to realize is that these are not defined terms by funded ratio, as you saw here. There's 3 ways to figure it. So you have to be very, yeah, at least. So you have to be very specific. There's multiple CPI tables, right? There's multiple periods. So when you come to the wording, so the wording starts off, and on your question, the wording starts off upon approval of the Board of Aldermen. So this is a measure to tell the, as currently worded, this is a measure to tell the Board of Aldermen, this is what you use as a measure, right? Theoretically, they could not approve it. If they didn't approve it, they wouldn't approve it. Theoretically, they could approve a higher rate if they wanted to approve a higher rate. But this was to say to them, you know, you need to consider it every year because your current plan really doesn't say anything. I don't know why the statement's even in there. It just says the board, that COLAs can be granted at any time at the discretion of the Board of Aldermen. That's all it says. So this is more specific instructions, kind of, if that's the right word, to the Board of Aldermen, that you should consider a COLA. It shouldn't just be merely discretionary. And when you consider it, you should use these parameters, right? But it's still subject to the approval of the Board of Aldermen. They still have we didn't take that power away from them unless you want to. We could make it absolutely set in the plan. The other thing, and Kevin will be much better at this than I am, because I am not an actuary. I'm an English major, not a math major, right? That's why I write, don't calculate. But there is a concept in federal law that's now been incorporated into Tennessee law by this 2015 legislation of an accrued benefit. So every day, your employees, your participants earn part of this benefit, right? So you can change you could come in if the Board of Aldermen decided to, and they could change prospectively the COLA. But part of that's already been earned. So there's some flexibility, but not complete flexibility. You see what I'm trying to say? Because you've earned something, right, up to that time. So you've earned it based on this COLA, and that is an accrued benefit. So you can't take away that day. The next day, you can say, okay, from here forward, you're going to earn 2% or whatever. You can change it. So there's both flexibility and solidity in putting a COLA amendment in the plan, which maybe when it was originally written, I didn't write it originally, when it was originally written in the plan, maybe that's why it was so broad, because they didn't want to have that sort of solidity. That help any?
Well, Frank, I'll ask you a question just for clarification. The 1%, does that box the plan in on providing at least 1% a year to anyone based on their current accrued benefit? So is that a fair statement?
It comes back to the introductory clause here, upon approval by the Board of Aldermen. So the 1% tells them, hey, that's the standard you should do. But the Board of Aldermen, based on that introductory statement, could say, we're not going to approve this COLA this year.
Okay, so they
You
could
know.
still choose to do 0,
Right.
and they could still choose to do above 3.5.
They could do 8 and 9, whatever, yeah.
So this almost just kind of creates some light guardrails,
Right.
maybe, or training wheels to
Right.
make sure,
Right.
at least create some.
It's kind of a shot across the bow to say, don't ignore a COLA. You got to look at it every year, because it's written in here that you're supposed to look at it every year, and you're supposed to look at it within these parameters.
Yeah,
And-
I think
and
that makes sense. I think that, gosh, if you go back to the 70s, all of a sudden we're sitting here, and the decision we made today
Yeah.
inhibits us or prohibits us from doing something 10 years from now. That wouldn't be very wise, but guardrails are great, right? I mean, just to get everybody knows what we maximum can have, then next year we'll know if the max is 3.5, but if we still, keep seeing inflation go up, then you've got
Then the
a
board
plan to
would
get
go
there. Like the
outside
10 basis
parameters.
points to me,
Right.
it's a whole lot easier.
Right.
Yeah.
It does set at least the board, when they're acting in that capacity, are acting as fiduciaries. So if they go out of 3.5, they're going to have a fiduciary reason for doing that. Or else it would be questioned, because somebody's going to measure them against this, because it's in writing, right? So what's your basis, and is that a fiduciarily wise, prudent thing to do? But within those parameters, and that's just a question of your budget. If you can afford it in your budget, then it's probably prudent.
Well, if it goes up, the problem is the market plan's gonna be losing value.
Oh, yeah, oh, yeah. Yeah, that's where your 1% may catch you a little off guard.
One thing I don't know the answer to, and I don't know if we have it or can calculate it, kind of to Chris's question, do we have an assessment of financial impact if 3.5 became 4 on the cap, or 2.5 became 3? Can you guys give us that, or can you work on that and give us that? I suspect Chris won't be the only one to ask that question. So we should probably have that, just so we know the magnitude of what it means. I think our recommendation is somewhere in this range, but it would be helpful to know what that might, if there was bumped, something like a 0.5 point or whatever, what would that, 0.5%, what would that look like?
Right, and we could certainly calculate that. Based on the way it's written right now, I don't really see any cost impact to the plan, because when we look at inflation, based on the CPI, we're looking at kind of a bell curve right around probably 2.25%, 2%, maybe somewhat ignoring the last 12 months, assuming that's somewhat of an anomaly, which means if we're kind of taking off the less than 1%, taking off the greater than 3.5%, we're still in a pretty tight range, right around 2%. So this probably is not enough to change our assumption for what the COLA.
This kind of captures what we've got baked in. Is that fair?
Exactly,
Okay.
exactly.
All right.
If the 3.5 goes up to 4, for example, and we would also probably, the 2.5 at 60 to 80%, we'd probably discount that assumption simply because we're assuming we're going to stay above the 80%. But if the 3.5 goes up to 4, that might be enough to move the assumption a 1/4 of a point.
Okay.
But a pretty small impact overall.
Well, I think that question that Eric just asked is what the 7 or 8 board members are going to ask, is what the impact is to the annual budget, to the plan itself, what it does to the plan 10 years from now, 15 years from now, 20 years from now, whatever it is. So I think that's very important, because you've got 4.5 now. So if you're looking at 3.5, what we did this year for 4.5, if you're looking at 3.5 or whatever you're looking at, then look at the difference between 3.5 to 4.5 or whatever each time a percentage is added or half a percent is added. So I know, I don't know the specific questions from all 7 other board members, but I suspect I understand a couple of questions from a couple of the board members who have asked that question. Why is it 4.5, or why is it this, why is it that, over the last 15 or 20 years? So I was a little surprised at the 6% that you had for the very first time. What? I don't remember anything that we did out of the well, I shouldn't say, that kind of dates me, I guess, if I'm trying to remember what happened in '92. But I don't remember, we didn't have.
Well, and I had, I'd raised my eyebrow at it too, but then when you looked at what happened in that CPI calculation year over year, it was close to that. I mean, the
Okay.
6%, it's almost like they took the actual and rounded it up to the next highest percent. I mean, I wasn't there, but that's to me almost what it looked like, that they did the calculation, and then it was rounded up because it was within that percentage of the actual. And then 93, it went back down. Like you looked at the CPI, change in CPI the next year, I mean, it's not always been just spot on, but it's been, when you look at what's happened in this, from 93 to 2022, it's pretty dang close.
Yeah.
When you do that calculation. I think it's always been at least part of the consideration, even if maybe if it wasn't expressed. And
Yeah, I think we've looked at the cost of living increases every year that we've ever looked at the budget. That's been a standard practice that we've done, so. Any other questions or comments or procedures or where we want to go from here? I may want to look at this a little bit more.
Yeah, that was the thing I was going
Yeah,
to say.
and
If you-
rather than, because
We have
we've got a couple
Tentative
of,
plan for the first week in December to meet again as a committee.
we'd like to get y'all back together the 1st of
Yeah,
December.
and yeah, if you're comfortable having a little bit of time, come back to it then. Maybe ask you for what kind of recommendation you want to make to the board, and then we can bring it to them maybe for at least a first review at their December meeting, and then get it enacted maybe in January so that we're ready to go with the calculation in April and implemented in July. So there's time to work with, and we understand this is a lot. I think it's the right direction to go with a policy so that we're making a policy not in the heat of a calculation or something immediate. You're looking at the bigger picture. So I think we're doing the right thing, and it serves us well to give us a little bit of time.
I don't think you'll have any resistance to the policy. Where the questions will come is whether that
The
3.5
details, right?
is high enough.
Yeah.
Any other, Mayor?
Well, I'd like to, I don't want to add too much to it right now, but looking back at what the TCRS does, they max theirs out at 3%, and I'm not advocating a max of 3%. I'm just trying to say what was their rationale in reaching that. I do like that we're going to try to establish a policy, because I think whenever you get up there in those chairs and you're getting ready to vote, sometimes emotion can outweigh good practical mathematical skills or actuarial things. So I think we need to sleep on it a little bit more. But ultimately, it's still up to the Board of Mayor and Aldermen, if I understand Frank right.
That's right. That's right.
But you would, see if I'll phrase this, you take some of the politics out if you've got this looking at it, okay? Which I like that. Yeah.
And if I could also just say that people, people in Tennessee who have been members of TCRS for a long time or retirees, they're well-versed in that cost of living policy. If if you've got friends who are school teachers or, retired county workers or other city workers, state employees, and they know this well, and they kind of know how to plan. At least it's, our plan, like Frank described, is it's just very broad. We have practice, but the TCRS retirees, they're well versed and they know when the notices are going to come. And I mean, it actually gives a month of the year that it's expected to happen. And so somewhere down the road, if the board puts a policy in place, I'm sure our retirees will have that same, will also be very well versed in whatever it is, instead of just maybe waiting to see what happens. So just thought I would throw that in.
And just by way of comment, I would say that the numbers that we've come up with, I think make sense to me. I think that actually 3.5 seems actually, to me, just a touch high. But the floor of a 1, that's good. And then also what the mayor says, if you look at what TCRS has done to cap it at a 3, I'd feel weird if we were to suggest that we have something higher than a 3.5. I know this, I'm just saying it now because we're just talking about it, we're not voting on it. So those are my thoughts.
Well, let me say this to the committee then. I would give it some additional thought. When we come back in December to meet this, we're going to need to make a recommendation at that particular time to the board, so the board can vote on it at least. You probably will only have one meeting in December for the board, so that probably will not come up until the first meeting in January. So we can go through this, and I would suspect do you think it's more than one reading, or is it one, would it be?
I think it's just one. It's a resolution, so it's
Just-
one reading, yeah.
Okay.
I would say something of this magnitude for the board too, work session, and then come back in January for a
Okay.
final vote at voting session. Give it
So-
a little bit of time for them to think about it too.
So is this meeting then that we are scheduled for the pension and trust prior to the only meeting and work session that we'll have in December?
That's the plan, yeah.
Sounds like a winner. Keep on winning. If there's no other questions, then let's go to item 6. Christine, you're up.
I think I'll ask Mr. Carney to describe, I believe it was this time last year, we talked about a state law that involved, or could be applicable to maybe former employees of the city of Franklin who go to work for a TCRS employer next down the line in their careers. And certainly, now there's been another state law passed, which I would, maybe Mr. Harney, and also Kevin has some recent information about this law as well.
And quite frankly, I expect a third state law to be passed. Because this is a difficult thing to do, period. But when you're having prior service from different employers, that's just kind of an anomaly, right? I always tell people, if I got hired by Franklin, you're not going to count the prior service I have at Evans and Petrie, right? We're totally disassociated. And while many employers are in the TCRS, there are employers who are not, and this statute affected them. The first statute, I think, came as much a surprise to TCRS as it did to anybody else. Don't know quite where it came from, but when it first came out, it just said, if an employee left from here and went to TCRS and wanted this time to count in TCRS, they could do that, and this plan had to forward to TCRS all of its contributions attributable to the employee, which has a host of problems because this is a defined benefit plan and there's no dollar attributable to any employee. So there are all those problems. TCRS realized this, I think, as quickly as the rest of us did, plus the fact that you're now telling an unrelated employer what to do with their money, and that's a major issue in and of itself. So then they came out with this, which is a much more considered statute, and they said, we're going to let the member purchase time in TCRS. However the member comes up with the money is up to the member. So they released that kind of offensive provision of telling an unrelated employer that they had to send money to TCRS. So and there are a variety of ways they could do it. If someone retired from or terminated from Franklin and they had access to a cash distribution, they could take that cash distribution, go over to TCRS and buy whatever time it would buy. It's only going to buy whatever TCRS's plan lets it buy. Because TCRS has not, in this statute or the prior statute, assumed any liability for that time. You have to completely buy that time. The expense of that is extreme. And so it's going to, it'd be a little surprising that someone would do that unless it's a real quick turnaround. But it could happen. The only problem in this statute that perplexes me is it says upon purchase of this retirement credit, the member forfeits all the member's service in the political subdivision's plan. Well, that I expect is going to change because you got a couple of problems. Number one is as we explained, there's an accrued benefit in this plan, right? And that can't be legally taken away, and that definitely takes it away. So I don't know how that works. And also you have the issue of if I leave and take my money out of the Franklin plan because I've properly retired or terminated, and I buy time in TCRS, I've already gotten my time in the system. So you can't go take it away from me. I've already got my money and gone. So that I think will change. But the nice thing about this restatute is it doesn't come into Franklin, except for that statement, it doesn't come into Franklin and make them do anything, which the previous statute did. So, and they'll have to figure, TCRS will have to figure out, and they're doing, Kevin can tell you, they're working on that now. They'll have to figure out the details of how this particularly works. You may never know whether someone does this. Because if I leave Franklin and I take my money and I go over to TCRS and I buy my time in TCRS, I'm never talking to you. You know, you may never know I did that. And so that's another problem with saying you forfeit your time over in the other system because you may never know whether somebody does that or not. They could use their own money. They could just, have the cash to do it with, and they just do it, and you would never know if they did that either. So, so there's still some issues in here to work out, but at least it got rid of the kind of the horrifying provisions that said you had to give money over to an unrelated employer. I'm happy to answer any questions. I hope that was helpful.
I'll just provide a few clarifying comments. So I've worked with a couple of other clients who are dealing with this as well, trying to understand what it means, trying to understand not only what it means for their plans, but what it means for their employees or former employees who may choose to use this. Just a couple of clarifying comments to what Frank said. How this would work in theory is that if a participant worked, say, for the city of Franklin for a couple years, they then leave Franklin, go to work for TCRS, they can purchase that 2 years of service. Now, the trick is it's all or nothing. They can't say, well, I've got X amount of money, I want to go towards that service. No, they go to TCRS and say, I have 2 years of service. And the way it would, at least preliminarily work is something would come to the city of Franklin first to say this person had 2 years of service. TCRS would take it, calculate an amount for that person, then go to the person and say, this is how much it costs. And the person has to come up with it from their own resources. Now, that can be it can be from just cash they have. It could be from a qualified plan distribution. If they had any money, maybe employee contributions in the Franklin plan, they could take out and use that. But it's up to them to come up with it. So no money comes directly from the City of Franklin plan or any other plan to the TCRS plan. So then the participant has a question of whether or not they want to do it at that point. If they do it, then I think they would need to come back. Someone needs to come back to the City of Franklin and say, this person decided to purchase their service, because the way it's written, they forfeit not only any benefit they have in the plan, they forfeit the service as well, which means if they come back as a new employee, they don't get their past service back with the city because they've basically transferred it or moved it to the TCRS plan. And of course, there's no provision for it to come back the other way. So if someone does it, then changes their mind, they can't go back the opposite way. So that's, and of course, that's for the TCRS plan to deal with, not for City of Franklin or any other municipal plan to deal with. But there are a lot of, I think, to Frank's early point, and I'll freely admit that I was guilty of kind of laying this at TCRS's feet early on, but they freely admit this came from in their words, this came from the legislative side. This does not come from TCRS, so they're still working through the issues just along with everyone else. I think originally they planned on having this available this summer, but I think just with, they're putting together a Q&A and other documents. It looks like it's January of next year before they really think they'll have this ready to go. A couple of the other complexities of this, theoretically, someone could have 10 years of service with the City of Franklin or any other plan, be fully vested, have a benefit, and still have a desire to transfer that service. The problem is that the way it's written, they forfeit that benefit that the plan would have paid, even if the plan doesn't allow them to get the money out of the plan. So in other words, if the plan doesn't provide for a lump sum or some way to get that money out. So there's a lot of potential for participants to misunderstand what's happening here. So I think the communication with participants, which TCRS is undertaking, they're putting together a Q&A and things like that for participants. It's still a lot of opportunity for people to be confused about what's really happening or what's really available to them. I think in reality, many people may look into this, but not many people may do it. Because if you have significant service, let's say you worked for the City of Franklin in your 20s, and now you're in your 50s working for TCRS, so you may have some amount of service, you may have a small deferred vested benefit in the plan. It's still not going to make sense for you to buy that service because it's going to be a very large number that you're going to have to come up with to buy that service because you're now much closer to retirement than when you left the City of Franklin. So it may on the surface seem like something that's logical for someone to do, but I think when folks start looking at the dollar amounts involved and having to come up with that, there's probably not going to be that many people who do this.
Should we say thank you to the state legislature?
My fear is from the employee side, and one of the points is, well, I'll take it. So if you've got somebody who's accrued a benefit here at 2%, and they go over and buy a 1.5% benefit in TCRS, I'm not sure what our obligation is to say to the employee, wait, do you know what you're doing? So there are some things that eventually, when the Q&As come out, we'll have to kind of think about what do we do from our side, particularly in communication, what do we do from our side?
Yeah.
But that'll come up.
I think the only situations where people would want to do this is if they have some non-vested service that's a relatively small amount. So they're not losing any benefit in the City of Franklin plan because they were never vested in it to begin with. And they can buy a couple years of service with TCRS. Because if you're maybe 50 years old and you're going to work another 15 years with TCRS, that could be a good deal for you to buy a couple years of service and get a big bump in your benefit. But if you have a benefit in that existing plan, be it City of Franklin or Metro Nashville, wherever, it's probably not going to make sense for you to give up a benefit, come up with your own money to buy a benefit. It's hard to imagine where that would be a good deal for anyone.
Any questions or comments from anyone? Seeing none, hearing none. Next item, Christine.
Thank you. This next item that we'd like to ask for your comments on is something that certainly I came to work here on January 1st back in 2017, and one of the first things I realized was that pretty much everyone, not all the employees, but almost all of our employees choose to retire in the month of December. And December has, there's lots of retirements, and certainly HR is busy trying to help facilitate people to retire, as well as help departments get staffed and all that goes with that, all there at the end of the calendar year. And it makes, when you look at our plan documents for our closed plan, it certainly makes sense why that has been the pattern that many of our employees choose, is that the calculation period for most of our retirees is that final 36 months of their employment with us. Certainly, it's as you talked about these different tiers, most of our people are on the 36 months. A few of them are on 5 years, but let's say most of them right now are on the 3 years. And most of them, whether they have been here for longer than the minimum of required years for their retirement, they choose to go out there at the end of the plan year because that is the calculation period, is at the end of a plan year. And I will give credit that one of our active employees, who is also a supervisor and sees this from many different sides, just brought up, just for conversation purposes with staff, would there be any way that provision of the plan would allow for to look at the last 36 months of service, whether it's at the end of a plan year or not? And that's a little too simplified, because we have the right people who, if the board, this committee has an interest in looking at this, would draft something. But certainly, I think and Mr. Chairman, you may invite some folks who'd like to, if they'd like to make any comments. But I did pose this question to our actuary, Kevin Sullivan. Would there be any significant cost to this plan if there was more flexibility for employees to look at whether their retirement was at the end of the plan year or at the last 36 months of service? And I don't give you a chance to, it may add a complexity to doing the calculation because it's not just a plan year, but does it add anything more than maybe a little bit of complexity to an actuary who is doing that calculation?
I'll say it kind of depends on where people start retiring. So if right now almost everyone's retiring at the end of December, so they're making sure they're getting the 3 full years, and then they just go to kind of uniformly throughout the year, there's not much of a cost increase for that. If people were retiring uniformly throughout the year now, but then they get the benefit of having the final 36 months instead of final 3 years, there'd be some cost. So, but based on where it looks like people are retiring now, it's a pretty small cost impact of going to the rolling 36 months instead of the three full calendar years. So relatively small impact.
But we also, in addition to looking at the impact to the plan, there could be a benefit to employees if employees would rather retire. Let's say you choose to retire in May, and that can spread some of the retirements out throughout the year. The Human Resources Department can work with the department to help fill the positions, maybe have a little bit more spacing. Holidays sometimes can be tough times as well, in the hiring or training process. So there could be some benefits.
I guess
as
I'm
well.
missing something here. 36 months is 36 months, right? Well, I mean,
Not if you have to wait, it's the 3 calendar years,
but
or it's the 36-month look back whenever you start.
But there's some kind of vesting schedule, right? You had to be, whatever those things are. If we back that up, are we saying if you retired in June, we're giving you an extra 6 months, or does? So then why isn't this 2 nickels for a dime?
Well, okay, so if I retire in May, and you're gonna take into consideration December 31st back, I'm probably had a raise between January and May, so I'm gonna wait till December, so I get this whole year with my higher salary.
Okay, so we are then pushing that out. We are, there is
We're
a,
kind of encouraging, the plan is kind of encouraging people not to not to retire until December 31st.
Yeah.
So they get this whole calendar year. The presumption being that every calendar year your pay goes up, right? So you want your highest calendar year in that average. So if you use it on an end of a calendar year, and I want to leave in May, I'm going to take a little bath because last year I didn't have the raise that I got.
Oh, I got you.
January
Okay.
1.
Well, and I think additionally, correct me if I'm wrong, if you have accrued sick time or accrued vacation time, you get a lump sum check at the end of the year when you leave. So if you retire in December, you get that lump sum check, that is figured into to that year's salary. Well, if you do that in May, you've only got 5 months worth of salary, you add that to it, it doesn't help you.
Doing it on the 36 months would give you that same general benefit within the 36 months as opposed to forcing it into a calendar year calculation.
Right.
Again, I don't know that it has any significant financial impact. It's maybe a little more convenient. It might help us spread out some of the retirements so they don't happen all at once. Gives folks an option.
Right. Generally, the reason people are retiring in December now is it makes good financial sense to do that. It's not that it's not that they're winning. It's almost like if you choose to retire April, May, June, you may be losing a little bit because it's not just the pay increases recently. It's that, those 4 months, if you retire April 30th, were higher than your pay 3 years ago that it would replace if you're using the 36-month average. If you're just doing the full calendar years, then from January 1, it's the same 3 calendar years really till you get late enough in the year that your earnings for that year plus any sick time that gets brought in replaces that year from 3 years ago. But if you're doing it on 36 months, it's pretty much you're always going to your highest is going to be the last 36 months for everyone.
A couple of meetings ago, we made a change for workman's comp issues that if you could substitute a year, how would this affect, or how would that affect this, or how would this affect that? Because that was, you're taking calendar years out, so can you just skip those 6 months and you see what I'm saying? How does that?
It's a great question.
How do those
I
two
don't know
work
if I'm
together?
Smart enough to think off the top of my head, but
Yeah, we may have to revisit that a little bit. My immediate thought is that it may still be the issue of the rolling 36 versus the years with the year knocked out and replaced as that legislation provided.
Yeah, we may want to look at that in terms of, we could consider, I don't know how this would play out, but say you were on workers' comp for 6 months, could you just go replace that 6 months with a look back of 6 months?
it might not make, here again, I'm.
Because the way the math works is, the employee's essentially whole because it's not taxable, but the rate is lower, so it
Right.
lowers that averaging. And so we were trying to just sort of hold it harmless or substitute in the next regular pay period for the period that they were on workers' comp.
Yeah, well, we basically weren't considering workers' comp as comp in these calculations.
Yes.
right? So now we are,
Yeah.
so I don't know that it would, see, now we are. we
Or you
weren't.
do the 36 months without workers' comp? Would that be how you define it?
Or you just might use the 36 months with workers' comp. I mean, that would have a little cost.
Yeah, you would have a lower number. It would drag your average down because
Yeah,
of the way
well,
it's done.
Yeah, presuming you went on workers' comp the first of the year.
Yeah,
Yeah,
well,
I mean, it's a lot of.
Anytime in the
permanent.
36 months, it's
Yeah,
it's a
right.
lower number than what they're getting in regular pay, even though, because the way taxes are treated, they're essentially whole.
Yeah, but I guess what I'm thinking is if you were doing 36 months formally, because you don't consider that workers' comp period, they
Mm-hmm.
were lower, now it's gonna, should jump up a little, because you're gonna consider that workers' comp. You weren't considering it all in the 36 months, right?
No, I think,
It
In
wasn't
the 3
tax-
years, it was just a lower number.
Oh, yeah, okay, you're considering it.
And so we had people essentially staying on to
Yeah.
fix the average, and like, well, what if we just substituted
Yeah,
the most recent full year for that year that had the workers' comp impact?
yeah, oh, yeah.
So that's what we did.
That's what we did.
Gross it up, or
I think eliminating it,
Eliminate
more
it, yeah, for whatever period it is, eliminate it and substitute the previously worked time would, to me, make the most sense. Grossing up feels like that's a little, I don't know. Yeah. And it's not their actual compensation. It feels a little weird.
I would think that time period that they're on, they're receiving workman's compensation, that's the period that's pulled out. So it's the last 36 months minus that, and then it's just actual wages. You see what I'm saying?
So you do it for less than 36 months, or you'd substitute in?
Well, we say substitute, it's like you go on back 36 months, but you don't, I hear you're saying.
You net out, it's probably the same thing.
Okay, I hear you're saying, yeah.
If it happened over 40 months, 4 months were on workers' comp, the 36 months
Goes, yeah, you have to go
would
back
be
further.
back
incorporated in
40
that.
months.
You just, we wouldn't include the,
Or maybe even just
Same thing, I
figure it
think.
over 32 months. Taking the 32
see, that's what I was wondering. That's what I thought you were saying originally, and I'm
No,
not sure we would do that.
Because think about it, if somebody's retiring, they're going to have plenty of months.
Right.
So let's just say we're going to go back 36 months. We're not going to use months though in which you receive workers' compensation.
Right.
So that might mean, okay, now I've got to go back 37, 38.
36 months at full pay,
Yeah.
whatever that is. I think that's probably the right way to address it. Let's think about that a little
Yeah,
bit.
I'd want to go back.
Chris
and look
brought
at
up a
it.
good question.
And just so you understand the distinction is, when they're getting under workers' comp, they're not getting paid, maybe you already know this, they're not getting paid the same way, so that's like a huge negative to say we have to factor in workers' comp. It's like a zero.
Right, right.
Point of all this is that's a great question.
Yeah.
You crushed it.
But does the committee see a value in us crafting for the December meeting for your consideration, something that would give more flexibility on the timing for this retirement? Because probably a lot of people are so ingrained, they're still going to be thinking about retiring in December, but there could be some, I mean, we know of, I think there's some that, this change would give them an option to think about retiring at a different point in the calendar year without, the disadvantage of if they've had a raise and they don't want to lose, even a few months of having that counted in.
Sounds like to me, though, if you're leaving in May, you're still gonna leave money on the table, so why would anybody do this?
I don't see it that,
I don't think you really would.
I
In
think.
fact,
What were you saying about your accrued time or whatever it was?
So look, I shouldn't, I'm sorry, you can put it yourself. If you work part of a year, then you get that check for sick time, it's only gonna show your yearly compensation, might be the same.
the 12 months, yeah.
Yeah, but if you say, now we're gonna do the last 36 months, and then we give you that check, that last month is gonna be, it's gonna increase your average.
Which is the same effect that happens now. It would just happen over 36 months.
Is this not two nickels for a
No,
From an actuarial standpoint, I think it is kind of 2 nickels for a dime. But from a
Plan-
logistics and plan administration, it's just a different approach. And it gives employees a flexibility they don't have now.
Yeah.
right.
Yes,
I'm with
because
you on that.
the plan
Yes.
document said, the plan document actually says calendar years.
Yeah,
That's-
we need
that-
to
that's
adjust
why
it to
we're-
allow for it.
Yeah, because right now, someone could have in their mind, I want to retire at the end of February, but they know they're going to get that extra time paid, and they're not going to get any credit for that, because that's going to fall in a new year that's not going to be in the average. The average is going to be the 3 preceding years. So they would have either said, I need to go ahead and retire 2 months earlier, get that time paid, get it in the average, because that's going to raise their
Or
average.
stay for 10 more months.
Yeah, so they're either going to go 2 months early or stay 10 more months.
So if it's the city to get off of it.
Yeah, and that's a good point, because when I look at it, I'm looking at it solely from the plan standpoint. And so that's one piece I don't really take into consideration, which I think we should, is, does it benefit the city to get people to go the 2 months earlier than hanging around 10 more months? Or to get them to go at the end of February? Because I think the natural progression is that people are going to tend to wait a little bit as opposed to going a little early.
Or as Christine said, not have everybody retiring in December. That's where their real issue, that's where the issue arose, is that everybody just waits till December, and then you just have a flood.
Because people may not realize until the end of January that they should have retired in December to maximize things.
So the answer to the question that was posed, does it make sense? I'll say, for me as a committee member who's the head of HR, I see the people who would like to retire a certain time, but no, they've got to stay 10 more months. I was like, it's just not what you want to happen. So yes, I do see a benefit, and it's not about HR, it's about the employee. That's the other piece too, is staffing. It is a nightmare. Everyone's leaving at the same time end of the year, so I would advocate for it. Especially since you're telling me we're not talking about it hurting the plan, hurting the city now. It's not.
Mr. Chairman, I think 3 things. 1, the employees would appreciate it. 2, the city would benefit. But number 3, do the workers' comp work just to know where
Yeah.
we are.
Yeah.
I
And number
think
4
that's a fairly easy fix. We were just talking about that. I think we can deal with that. We'll incorporate that with the bring back.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yep. Bring the English major in for that.
I will make my second offer to anyone in the audience. If anyone has a question on what we've just got through discussing,
people who might have
Sound
talked to
good?
me every time they talk to
Sound
me.
good? Okay.
Uh-huh.
I could point out one thing where the city might actually save some money in this, is the way vacation time is accrued, how much you can carry over in the year.
yeah.
Is based on the calendar year. So if someone wants to, say, retire in February, they can only accrue
With that carryover.
2 months of vacation.
It's gonna pay out.
Yeah.
And that's gonna go towards the plan.
Yeah.
So that's where it might be more beneficial for the city.
Yeah.
Just giving the employee the option.
Probably not a huge number, but there would be some.
On that vacation time being averaged in.
Yeah.
So what we're basically looking at here is an option that allows an employee to retire anytime during the year without being penalized, is in their view, from accrued vacation or whatever that they're looking at it, getting it in. Because they don't actually get the increase until, the pay increase doesn't actually go into effect till July 1st anyway. So they're only looking at 6 months.
Yeah. Most years, that's a July, the biggest major increase happens in July.
That's
There have
right,
been
yeah.
times we've done it
Yeah.
first of the year, depending on what's going on in the
So
budget.
we have given some.
Yeah.
Some increases where we've delayed a July 1st increase or something other, but, yeah.
I think to the officer's point, okay, I'm losing a few months of accrued time. If I'm the retiree, I might go, that's worth it, I can go. If I'm forfeiting a years that I've rolled over, plus another year, plus my sick time, that's a much bigger hit that I'm taking. So I think you still may take a hit as a retiree, but it's much more, it may be much more attractive than right now. Because, I mean, personally, I've seen a lot of guys that have stuck around 6, 8, 10 months. I've got one of my guys I work with now that is eligible to retire, I think, in July of next year, and he's like, I can go, but I got to stay. And so it is going to be a positive.
Yeah.
It is going to be a positive thing, I think, for the employees.
So we can look forward to that for the next meeting's agenda.
We'll work with our attorneys, and we'll have something for the committee to consider in December. Thank you for that feedback. We appreciate that.
Now, remember, this is Christmas time now.
We'll bring you a present. Don't worry.
I was-
This may
I
be in the
was-
form of another resolution.
I'm going to need 36 months to think about it. The way it's going to be.
Any other business to come before the committee?
Just simply a recommendation for the next meeting, which we'll have some business at as well. Monday, December the 5th, is that would allow us to be able to, for potentially to get an item to the full board for the work session in December.
Regular work session and, yeah,
that-
Board of Mayor and Alderman meeting.
That's not the week of a full board meeting, but it is early so that we can get to the full board if, I can send that out if that.
The 5th, you said?
Yes.
December the 5th,
Monday, December the 5th
5th
at
at
1
1
p.m.
o'clock?
1 p.m., all right. Any other questions or comments? Mayor?
Move we adjourn.
Second, all in favor indicate by saying aye. Aye.
We got our
We-
money's worth out of you all today.
We are adjourned.